Thank you very much, and first of all, my apologies for doing this in English. But second, I'm really delighted to share some of the findings from our global education comparisons with you today. If you look at the industrialized world, you will find that never before had the people who are well educated the kind of life chances they have today. But never before had the people who struggled with education to pay the kind of penalties on the labor market they have to pay today. We see a growing gap between those who are better prepared and less prepared in terms of education and their future. You can argue, is good mathematics and science performance a guarantee for being happy? Probably not. But we can say that the absence of foundation skills is certainly a guarantee for social exclusion in the world today. We can also say that the absence of mathematics and science skills doesn't imply the presence of happiness. Quite on the opposite. If you look at the results from PISA, there is actually a very positive relationship between students who are well prepared and their engagement in school, their attitudes to schooling, their attitudes to learning, their well-being at school. Those things should not be seen as opposing poles, but in fact as things that you can achieve together. And my presentation today will focus on what we have learned about systems that do succeed in achieving high levels of educational quality. And this is not about simple content knowledge. This is about the capacity of people to creatively use what they have learned in school in their engagement in schooling. Just a few words about PISA, our comparisons at the OECD. We started in the OECD countries, but progressively you could see actually more and more countries have joined the assessment, and that includes Lithuania since recently. So we have a fairly good picture of how well prepared young people around the world are in most important subject areas. In 2009 we did our latest assessment. And one of the things that is important is that we are not interested whether students can simply reproduce content knowledge. In fact, you could argue that students in Lithuania are quite good at this. If you look at the PISA tasks assessing whether students can remember what they have learned in school, Lithuanian students do quite well. But what we're interested in PISA is the capacity of students to extrapolate from what they have learned, to make sense of what they have learned, to apply their knowledge in novel, unfamiliar situations. Some people say, well, this is an unfair assessment. You test our students with things that we haven't taught them. And that's true. That's what PISA does. But if you consider it unfair, then you have to consider life unfair, no? Because in the modern life, that is what happens to you every day. Nobody asks you whether you remember what you learned in school, but people ask you whether you can actually solve real problems in real situations. And so that's what we looked at. And of course, this doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the social context, and we collect data from parents, from teachers, from school principals, from system leavers, to get a really good picture of how learning occurs. Learning is not just mirrored in the knowledge of students, but in the system as a whole. So that's, in a nutshell, what the PISA assessment is about. And of course, the first question everybody asks is, how do countries come out of this? And you can do what the media like to do. You can sort of line up performance into three areas. In green are the countries that are doing really well. Yellow is sort of so-so, and red are the countries that are not doing as well as the OECD average. And if you look at this, you can see Shanghai and China tops the list. And if you think this is all about culture, well, you will find actually some Asian countries that are not doing so well. You find Finland, a very high-performing education system, Estonia in this area as well, Canada in North America. You can actually see in every part of the world, you do find children who are at the age of 15 who are really well prepared. And I'm going to show you some examples of what those children can actually do. But that's only one side of the equation. The second part is, how well do education systems use the potential of children from all backgrounds? In some education systems, there's a large gap between winners and losers. Success depends very closely on the social background from which you come. Whereas in other education systems, societies succeed to capitalize on the potential of all children, to ensure that success doesn't depend on where you're born. And if you know that your life chances are determined by your social background, surely the likelihood to be happy is much lower. Everybody wants to be there, but performance is very strong and equity is strong. Nobody likes to be there where performance is poor and there are large social disparities. And people argue, is it better to be there where performance is good at the price of large disparities? Or do you want to focus on equity at the price of mediocrity? But actually, if you look at how countries come out, you do see that a fair number of countries actually succeed in both, in guaranteeing high levels of quality and ensuring equity. Again, Finland in your neighborhood comes to mind. Many Asian countries as well, Canada, other examples. The systems succeed for almost all of their students. Now, we have done PISA not just in 2009, but we did since quite a while, and I want to give those countries that have participated in PISA since the year 2000 a colored dot. Lithuania was not among them, so you don't get a dot, but most countries do. And I want to make it a bit more complicated. The size of the dot tells you how much money is being invested per student in education system. Professor Lezuka has already mentioned that money is not a guarantee for happiness, but you can also see money is not a guarantee for educational success. If success would only depend on money, you would see only all the large bubbles at the top, the high-performing systems, and all the small bubbles at the bottom, the low-performing systems. But the resources that are spent on education only explain about 20% of the variation in the performance of countries. 80% have to do with how you invest your money. You can see, for example, that most of the systems doing well, when they think about how to spend the money, they tend to prioritize the quality of teachers over the size of classes. Lots of things that we can actually see in this. And this was in the year 2009. Let's have a look at how the world looked in the year 2000. You can see the bubbles like this. The first thing that strikes you is that the bubbles were much smaller. In the year 2000, we spent about 40% less on education than we spent in the year 2009. So if education has become so much more expensive, has it become so much better? Let's have a look at this. Let's think about Korea. In the year 2000, Korea was already one of the best performing systems in the OECD area. But Korea was actually not happy with its education performance. Korean educators knew they were doing well on average, but they didn't have high levels of excellence in the system. So what they did is they put a lot of resources, a lot of investment in getting the top performing students to improve further. And if you can actually see how they did this, you can see how Korea moved up. They also moved to the left side, not to the more inequitable side, because if you only focus on your top performers, you get larger disparities. So quite predictable. But in fact, they were able to raise their performance. Chile is another example. In the year 2000, I couldn't have shown Chile on this map because their performance was so low, but you can see they actually moved almost a full school year ahead in a very short time. If you think about Europe, the most ambitious reform in Europe was carried out by Poland. Poland was able in the last 10 years to reduce the between-school variability of school performance by half through a very courageous reform of the structure of the education system, so a very courageous reform of teacher education, and so on. And you can actually see how this played out. You can see how significantly Poland was able to improve its performance. I spoke with Minister Handke the one who launched this reform in Poland, and listen to what he had to say about this.
Czasem jak zbyt długo coś się dzieje bez zmian, to się popada w taką, powiedziałbym, rutynę, która wcale niekoniecznie jest mechanizmem naprawiającym, poprawiającym. Ja myślę, że ta reforma sama w sobie była o tyle dobra, że jakby to powiedzieć, wytrąciła stary system z takiego stanu równowagi.
W Polsce zapanowało przekonanie, że studia to nie jest, studia wyższe, to nie jest coś, na co zasługuje nieduży odsetek społeczeństwa, że powinien spróbować uczeń, który czuje taką potrzebę. Spowodowało to zjawisko 5-krotnego wzrostu liczby studentów. W końcu lat 90. w Polsce mieliśmy około 400 000 studentów. To było około 10% rocznika mniej więcej. Aktualnie mamy niemal 2 miliony studentów. To jest prawie co drugi młody człowiek z kohorty wiekowej, która potencjalnie może wejść na studia. Jest to sukces ogromny, dlatego że bardzo wiele krajów boryka się właśnie z tym problemem zachęcenia młodych ludzi do tego, żeby zechcieli kontynuować edukację. Jednym z ważnych czynników, który spowodował ten trend, jest uświadomienie młodym ludziom tego, że ich stać na sukces edukacyjny, że nie są skazani na getto jakiejś bardzo prostej szkoły i tam na koniec, jaki koniec kariery edukacyjnej, że wszystkie drzwi są przed nimi otwarte, jeśli tylko włożą odpowiedni wysiłek. Skończenie gimnazjum to jest sukces dla bardzo wielu młodych ludzi, który otwiera im perspektywę następnych sukcesów edukacyjnych i bardzo wielu młodych ludzi z tego korzysta.
So you can see actually in a reasonably short period of history you can change the world, and there are more countries. You can see actually Portugal, another country, poor country, significantly raising performance, improving equity, or Hungary, or Germany. Fair number of countries actually moving forward. Unfortunately, the list of countries with those successes is not very long. So you can argue actually most countries have been fairly stable in their outcomes. And that includes Lithuania. But some actually demonstrate that real progress on quality, equity, and sometimes value for money is really possible. I want to highlight some of the challenges that our data highlight for Lithuania in the following diagram. This axis shows you the social background of students in schools. This axis shows you performance. And now I can map every school in Lithuania in this diagram. Now, the white schools are the public schools, the green dots are the private schools, the brown dots are the small rural schools in more difficult areas. And when you look at this diagram, the first thing that strikes you is, as social background advances, if you move to the right axis, the performance of schools is a lot better. So there is quite a dependency of the success of schools on the social environment in which they operate. But at the same time, when you just focus on, for example, these are all schools in poor neighborhoods, and you can see that some actually do quite well and others don't. So even under similar conditions, there's quite some variability in school performance. And if you go to the more privileged schools, now these are the schools in rich neighborhoods, you can see some do quite well, as you would expect. But you also see that some don't. So wealth is not a guarantee for being successful. There is an enormous amount of variability in the performance of schools. And then Lithuania is not the only country with this. There are actually many countries in this situation, some with much larger gaps. My own country, Germany, one of them. But there are also some countries that have very successfully addressed those challenges. You can go as far as Shanghai. Remember, that was the top performing education system. 6 years ago, Shanghai was so-so in its results. What Shanghai did was it attracted the best principals to the toughest schools. And it got the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms. through a system where it built career perspectives through addressing challenges. You know, if you're a vice principal in a school that is high-performing in Shanghai, the only way you can become a principal is by taking on one of the toughest schools and show that you can actually lead it to improvement. And the same for the teachers. And the education system does not leave you alone with this. You can take some of your teachers with you. And so they started to pair high-performing and poor-performing schools. And listen to what the governor explained about this. Oops, something.
那么如何来改变这种现状呢？我们就想到了，是不是能够把一些好的学校与相对困难的学校结成办学联合体呢？这个建议得到了我们教育行政部门，当然也得到了社区的广泛的认同与支持，于是我们就开展了这项工作。那么这项工作是怎么来做的呢？从政府来说，我们出台了相应的政策，就是鼓励与支持办学相对好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子。第二呢，我们好的学校与相对困难学校结成对子呢，我们要签订一个合作办学的协议。这个合作办学协议里面呢，就是明确了各自的责任、权利与义务。
So the reason I'm showing you this small video clip is to show you that we shouldn't just say, you know, Shanghai improved its education, but that's a very far country with a very different culture. You know, in the last 6 years, China didn't change its culture. It didn't exchange its teachers. It didn't change its students. It changed the way in which it dealt with the disparities in the education system. And it shows that those kinds of disparities are amenable to improvement. And if you don't want to look at China, look at Poland. Same kind of picture. Dramatic reduction in the between-school variability of school performance. So problems can actually be addressed. I want to highlight this issue in another way. We can ask ourselves, what's the share of students who succeed despite family disadvantage? And you can see in some countries, you can see that the share of what we call resilient student is very high. In Asia, in Finland, you can say at least half of the students who are coming from disadvantaged families succeed. If you look at many countries, it's just about, if you look to Lithuania, it's just about 1 in 5 students coming from a poor family background who nevertheless makes it. And there are some countries doing worse than that. You can see in some countries, poverty is destiny. But what this chart also shows you, the resilience varies a lot across countries. It shows you that actually it is possible to enable students from poor backgrounds to overcome personal disadvantage. So you can ask yourself, and this comes back to the question of happiness, does it really matter? One way to explore that is to see to what extent does success at age 15 on PISA actually predict the performance at school. And we can actually see that those results in PISA are a very, very strong predictor for the future success of students to enter universities, to get high-paying jobs, and many other aspects. Some of the factors that we have found to be associated with good performance across countries: discipline, teacher behavior as seen through the eyes of students, expectations from parents, teacher-student relationships. You know, when students reported, my teacher really knows what I can do, my teacher helps me when I need help, my teacher supports me, my teacher understands the way I learn, so students tended to better. What is negatively associated performance? Grade repetition. If a school says, you know, my student didn't succeed this year, let them deal with another teacher next year. Negatively associated with performance, negatively associated with equity. Tracking and streaming. You know, some education systems, particularly in Europe, have the culture, if a student didn't succeed in my school, let's send him to a school with lower performance expectation, a vocational school, for example. And we can actually see this is actually reinforcing social disparities and not raising outcomes. Quite clear. Same for expulsions. No? If you think that there may be another school better prepared to deal with a student, ability grouping. Very interesting findings that actually they come out quite consistently across countries. At the system level, having national exams, national standards, clearly articulated expectations of what students should be able to do, very important predictor for student success. Standardized tests is interesting. You know, some people believe you test your students more and you're going to do better. It's not what we see in PISA. It's not a negative effect, but also not a positive effect. It does have a positive effect on equity. Countries that apply more tests tend to have a more equitable distribution of learning outcomes because probably they see where poor performance is and can actually handle this better. School autonomy, very important predictor for the success of system. But I come back to this in a moment because school autonomy is very much depending on the context in which it operates. Choice and competition, the picture is so-so. You know, some people believe you need to offer more choice, more competition. When you control for social background, actually you see very little of a comparative advantage. Same for private schools. You've seen that in Lithuania, but it holds for most countries. Private schools don't do better than public schools once you account for social background. On the way you manage resources, I mentioned already, systems doing well tend to prioritize the working conditions of teachers over things like class sizes. Preschool, another important predictor for the performance of schools and students and so on. So we can identify a lot of factors that relate to learning outcomes in one or the other way on this PISA assessment. Again, I wanted to come to the issue to what extent this is actually predicting future success. And here you see, on the example of Canada, how your performance at age 15 had an influence on your results at age 19 in terms of getting a well-paying job or getting access to university. And you can see the children who had achieved level 2 on PISA were twice as likely to have moved on to a successful career at age 19 than the children who had only achieved level 1, the baseline level. At level 3, you can say they were 4 times as likely. At level 4, they were 8 times as likely. At level 5, they were 16 times as likely. So what you can see here, your competency is at age 15, is a very powerful predictor for your success later in life, after accounting for social background and everything else. And now you can say, oh, well, these kids were just 19 years. Lots of things can happen. Let's look at how the results looked at age 21. And you can say, actually, what you were able to do at age 15 and is an even stronger predictor for your performance at age 21 than it was at age 19. There are 2 things you can deduct from this. The first thing is education really matters. What you're able to do at age 15 is very, very important for your future success in life. You can also conclude from this that what you haven't got right at the age of 15 is very hard to predict. The odds of success are just very small. You always find a few people who are succeeding despite poor education, but there are just not very many of them. Now you can say, okay, let's get rid of this PISA thing, competency, and let's put back content knowledge, school marks. And you can see they also predict something, but they actually predict a lot less. Your capacity to remember something and to be rewarded for this predicts a lot less than your capacity to creatively use and apply knowledge. But both are important. So what have we learned from this? There's 7 things I want to highlight here that come out from our PISA assessment when you look at the best performing education systems around the world. The first sounds almost trivial, but it has to do with the value a society attaches to education. If you look to Finland in Europe, to China, to Japan, to Ontario and Canada, you can see that citizens make choices that demonstrate that they value education more than other things. They make investments into the future, which is what education is about, rather than the present. You have some other countries, it's the other way around. You know, the shopping center will be a more beautiful building than the school building. You know? People value the present more than the future. And actually, this is one prerequisite for this. But the other part is the expectation that every child can succeed in education. And this is mirrored in the establishment of universal educational standards. The same expectation placed on students from all social backgrounds, as opposed to saying, you know, students have different talents, different destinations, let's put them in different school types, different tracks, different streams, and so on, which is what you see in many of the other countries. There's also very clear articulation of who is accountable to whom and for what. The role of parents, the role of students, the role of teachers, very clearly articulated. You can see that very nicely. You know, you go to Sweden, to Finland, at the end of a school year, you don't only get a school mark, but actually your teacher meets with the student and the parent and actually works out, you know, what did go well, what did not go well, and what can we do to improve your performance in a way that leads you forward. And the only golden rule in those student-parent-teacher dialogues is that you're not allowed to complain about someone else. No? As a teacher, you're not allowed to complain about the student. As a parent, you're not allowed to complain about the teacher. But everybody has to think, what can I contribute to improve those results? And that is more important than the grade that students get. But that's sort of what I mean here by accountability for what, to whom. Clarity about this. Second aspect is goals and gateways in education are very clearly articulated. You can see basically that in high-performing systems, students, teachers, parents know what counts in education. They have a very, very clear idea of what good performance is good. And they know that what their success in school will actually influence the success in life, in school. You know, why do Chinese students study so hard? Are they crazy? No, they know that basically they cannot buy themselves into a high-performing university. No employer is going to look at them if they don't demonstrate improvement at school, success at school. But the second point, I think, is in the case of Lithuania equally important, and that's high-performing systems tend to have a high level of metacognitive content in instruction. Students don't only learn what they learn, but they also develop very effective approaches to learning. They are aware of effective learning strategies. And we can actually test it in the PISA context. It's very interesting to see that students in high-performing systems, you know, they have an awareness of their approaches to learning. They can tailor their learning to the kind of things they learn rather than just sort of accumulating content. And I think that's an aspect, I think, very worth to look at the results for Lithuania and study them more deeply. The next has to do with capacity at the point of delivery, and I think this is obvious to all of us that in order to succeed, the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. So high-performing systems are able to attract the best people into the teaching profession, develop them well, support them well. And Lithuania has been very successful in raising teacher salaries. That's obviously one aspect of this, but probably not even the most important one. In our analysis, the more important aspects are to what extent do teachers really see career perspectives for their job. If you take a 25-year-old teacher and tell him, here, you know, you're going to be a mathematics teacher in this school. And 25 years from now, you're still going to be a mathematics teacher in this school. You're telling young people that their future is really set, that there is very little room for their personal development. And when you look at many of the high-performing systems, there are different stages in the development of a teacher career. You develop and learn throughout your life. There's very, very strong instructional leadership in schools. School principals are not just managing a building, but actually managing the human talent in their school, providing continuous opportunities for professional development. The Asian countries invest enormous amounts of resources. If you go to Shanghai again, 240 hours of professional development for every teacher every 3 years. If you go to Singapore, 100 hours every year for every teacher. Enormous investment in the human talent in school to upgrade the skills continually. Some people believe, oh, it's all about teacher selection at the beginning, initial teacher education. But you know, if you wait for this magic spaceship that brings you new teachers and you put them in an old system that is not functional, the education system will win every time. The question really is how to upgrade the teaching force. And the Finnish Minister of Education, I asked her about this, and this was the first thing she said about this.
I think one of the main reasons behind the good learning outcomes and results is the good teacher education. All the teachers, they have master's degree from the university in Finland, and because the teacher's profession is very highly appreciated in Finnish society, so it means that all the universities, they can select the best students to become a teacher. So of course it's helped because then they can get the most motivated and best people to become a teacher.
And you know, just to put a number to this, you can actually see that last year there were 6,000 applicants in Finland for 600 teaching jobs. Everybody wants to become a teacher. And they're not better paid than teachers in Lithuania in relative terms. But the teaching profession is much more attractive. It's a profession with a lot of professional autonomy, embedded in a collaborative culture where teachers work together with other teachers, learn together with other teachers, and look outward in their system. Very, very interesting example. It's to do with incentives and accountability, and I think I've said most of what I wanted to say about this. It's to do with a good balance between what we call vertical accountability and horizontal accountability. You know, vertical accountability is you talk to your boss, you talk to your school principal, you talk to your minister, and so on. But horizontal accountability is as important, you know. To what extent do you share your work with your fellow teachers? To what extent do you know what's happening in the neighboring schools? What are the mechanisms for knowledge management? How do you recognize a good teacher? How do you give public recognition to very effective teachers? How do teachers learn from teachers? Schools learn from schools. If you go to Japan in a school, you know, the teachers will work together to prepare the lessons, implement the lessons together, evaluate the lessons. And they will learn from each other, with each other, every day on a continuous basis. That's another form of accountability that's often forgotten. And you can actually see that very nicely in the following diagram. Actually, this is just, I'm going to skip this because we're a bit short of time. I want to show you this diagram, which shows you the interrelationship between autonomy and accountability. If you have a system with a well-established form of accountability, vertical, lateral, basically, everybody knows what everybody else is doing and everybody learns with everyone else. You actually see that schools with more autonomy perform significantly better on the PISA test. School autonomy embedded in a culture of accountability is a very, very positive factor across cultures and countries. But if you go to a system that does not have this culture of accountability, you actually see that more autonomous schools do worse. In fact, across the OECD area, the schools with a lot of autonomy, not embedded in a system of accountability, tend to be the worst performing schools. So it's very important not to look at accountability, autonomy, resources in isolation, but to look and study their interaction. I think it's a very, very important facet that's often forgotten. And you can actually see how this has evolved over time. You can basically, countries also always have to make choices between, you know, to what extent do you rely on prescription, government regulation, as opposed to having schools leading reform. And you can see the trend in OECD countries has been going in that direction. In the past, education was here. Most of what teachers did was determined, somewhere above their heads. You can see many OECD countries shifting here. But if you look to Finland and Europe, you can see actually that schools are the main drivers and leaders of reform. Teachers are the education system. Very important trend. I want to come back to the issue of resources. And what strikes you when you look at this across countries, it's not the volume of resources invested, but the capacity of systems to invest the resources where they can make most of a difference. When you look at students from privileged backgrounds, you know, it doesn't matter whether you go to school in Lithuania or Finland or Mexico or United States or Germany. Students from privileged background have a very narrow band of performance across the world. And the same is true for schools. Where education systems really differ is how they attract the resources to where they can actually make the greatest impact. And I told you the story of Shanghai, remember? Pairing schools. And after they had done this for 6 years, even in some of the most disadvantaged areas, the results had dramatically changed. I'm going to show you a small video that was recorded in a school in an area with 5 million immigrant workers, poor immigrant workers, living in very, very poor conditions. But 6 years on, the world had changed.
我们委托管理搞了3轮，所谓3轮是2年1轮。第1轮的时候，那对我们来讲，这个办法一下子改变了很多学校、基础学校的面貌，我们信心就得到了很大的增长。比如说，有的学校原来成绩一直往下掉，这个家长就带着孩子跑到其他学校去了。但是当我们这所比较薄弱的学校委托给一个专业团队管理以后，1年2年，学生都回来了，而且很多原来不在这里上学的孩子，他的爸爸妈妈都带着孩子到这个学校里面来，所以从学生的大逃亡，一直到很多家长孩子愿意到这所学校来，这2年时间里面发生了迅速的变化，所以使得我们感觉到这个办法看来还是能够改变薄弱学校的一个好办法。
So again, attracting the resources where they can make most of a difference, getting the most talented principals into the toughest schools, the best teachers into the most challenging classrooms. Ensuring that the education systems learn. In school we talk about learning of students, of course, but how do teachers learn? How do schools learn? How do education systems learn? And you can see that most of the successful systems are outward looking. The school is outward looking. The system is outward looking. What's the best measure of this? Between school variability. You know, look to your neighboring country, Finland. You can say, oh, they're doing well on average. Fine. But what is really striking is that only 5% of the performance variation among students lies between schools. Every school succeeds, and that tells you that every school knows what every other school has been doing. Outward looking, learning. Singapore is another great example of that kind of nature. The last point I want to make has to do with coherence, you know, ensuring that what you do in early childhood education matches up with what you expect in university. What you do in one public policy area matches up what happens in another. One important perspective of alignment, coherence. What you do today is going to count tomorrow. The worst thing we can do to teachers, and we can see lots of bad examples across the world, is say, you know, we have a new government, what we told you yesterday doesn't count anymore. We're going to tell you something different today. We have a lot of lack of coherence in education systems, not just across areas of public policy, but also across over time. Consistency of implementation, you know. It's one thing to have a great idea and a great policy, a lot of great policies. The challenge is often how to actually implement those policies in the classroom. The intended, implemented, achieved curriculum, getting that trajectory right. And finally, fidelity of implementation. How you get the minds of people at the front line actually into the reform, making them the owners of reform. Another education system that has been remarkably successful improving outcomes is Ontario in Canada. I spoke with the Premier of Ontario about his success, and this is how he explained it.
First of all, you need to bring to the task a sense of urgency, a sense that this is a very high priority. Then you need a plan. Then you need to enlist people to your cause, teachers included. And then you need persistence Well, close to 4 out of 10 Ontario students are immigrants. So we have a student population that is extremely rich in its diversity.
We need to deal with that diversity. And so it's not seen as a barrier, it's seen as an opportunity and a challenge. And I think one of the ways in which we've done that is by ensuring that we provide more supports and more resources in meaningful ways to schools that are more challenged. So we can identify the proportion of children living in poverty in a particular school population. We can identify the proportion of children who come to school without either English or French as their first language. And then we can work with that school and that school district to provide additional resources and to build additional capacity in the teaching staff and in the leadership of those schools and districts to assist them in meeting the needs of those children.
Now, this rate of improvement in Ontario, Canada, doesn't guarantee that those students are more happy today than their counterparts were 9 years ago. But what it tells you is that those students are better prepared to realize their potential. I have only 2 more minutes left, and I just want to wrap this presentation up very quickly by highlighting the kind of reform trajectories that we have seen across countries. If you look to the old bureaucratic education system and compare it with the modern enabling education system, the first you can see is actually what's the philosophy of education. You can see in the past it was sufficient and probably efficient for education systems to ensure that only some students succeed. You know, education was about sorting people. You needed a few people who were well educated who tell everybody else what to do. That was the past. What you see in the most successful systems, and I've demonstrated this with the data, is that all students need to be and can be succeeding to learn at high levels. Very, very different view of the economy and the society, that basically all people are contributors and not just some who are telling everybody else what to do. And that has to do with content as well. You know, in the past, when you could assume that what you teach today will last for the lifetime of a student, you would focus on content. You would teach the student something. But at a time where you can access educational content at Google and where that content changes so rapidly, you can no longer prepare young people for a defined future. What counts today are the capacity to learn, the capacity to think, the capacity to work with others, and so on. So those are the kind of things that are becoming more important in modern societies, and which education systems start to value more. And this is profound weighs on the capacity of teachers. When routine cognitive content is the objective of education, you actually don't need very high teacher quality. You can train people to do that very efficiently. But when you think about, you know, teachers who are there to shape the learning environment of students, to recognize the diversity of student learners, to recognize that different students learn differently and at different times, to engage with those different ways and basically personalize and individualize learning, to upgrade their skills continuously. You talk about high-level professional knowledge workers. Very, very different kind of the profession that we see today in the best performing systems. And that, of course, has to do with work organization, you know. When people work in education as if it was an industry, which is still the predominant model in many education systems. No? Ministry of Education defines what is to be done, a lot of people implement it, some people achieve. You have a very Tayloristic, hierarchical work organization. But as the examples of Finland and many of the Asian countries show, these countries have moved towards much more flat, collegial working environments with a connected professional autonomy embedded in a collaborative culture. And that also has implications on the kind of accountability systems. In the past, accountability was primarily to authorities. Today, it's equally important to have accountability to peers and other stakeholders. So what you see is that we've seen changes in the results of education systems, but also quite fundamental changes in the way in which education systems operate in some of the countries. You see that success is possible. Some countries demonstrate in different parts of the world, in different cultures, with different levels of economic development. You can do well, you can improve. We see that success of students does not necessarily depend on their social background. Education actually can become the great equalizer, even if the reality today is that in most countries education reinforces social disparities. And you can see that you can actually achieve also quite good value for money. The dependency of educational success on the level of resources investment is not as strong as we've always thought. Thank you very much.